Good morning, everyone. Russell Holden with Render Plus Software. Thanks for joining me today for this webinar, Rendering SketchUp Models, and today we'll be focused on the IRender Next rendering software by Render Plus Software. I want to make it clear to everyone that there is no experience required to get something useful out of this webinar. Many people who attend these webinars have a trial version installed. There are also, of course, advanced users who attend this webinar to become more familiar with some of the advanced features. If you are not aware, I want to encourage you to visit the Render Plus Systems channel on YouTube. There are video tutorials, some rendering tips, and also we started publishing to YouTube a few short videos on advanced rendering features. They're usually anywhere from 10 seconds to 90 seconds, so a very brief little introduction to an IRender Next feature. You might want to consider bookmarking the Render Plus Systems channel on YouTube. Visit it frequently, and I think you'll find that we upload new videos routinely. Also, renderplus.com is an invaluable resource. Nice links to some video tutorials, additionally comprehensive documentation and descriptions of our software products. Another good bookmark to add to your browser. Visit renderplus.com frequently and you'll keep up with what we're doing here at Render Plus Software. And also, anytime you need some documentation, it's all online on our website. Now we're focusing on rendering SketchUp models, and the interesting thing about SketchUp is that the modeler can be used to create models of virtually anything. And so, because I don't know specifically how you're using SketchUp in your organization, I'm going to use 3 different models today to illustrate rendering features. The first is a very simple little wooden table. This is opened from the 3D warehouse, and once the model is open, we can render it immediately. So we assume that when a model is opened, it is ready to render. Similarly, I've captured this beach cottage from the 3D warehouse, and without making any changes to it, we're going to render it. And then lastly, I did build a quick little model to illustrate some of the advanced features of IRender Next. This is a simple little one room with some furniture and light fixtures. So we're going to have a lot of fun with these models. As I'm going through this information today, I want to encourage you to ask questions. I have the question board up in front of me. I'm doing my best to monitor it constantly, and when I see a question come up, you can expect that what I will probably do is pause to answer that question. If the question means that we need to back up a little bit, I'm hoping everyone will be okay with that, because it's very important that if you have questions, we do our best to get them answered today, so that you can continue to develop your skills with IRender Next. Also, I do have a tendency to speak a little fast. If I am speaking too fast as I go through this information, please use the questions and just type in slow down. Trust me, that's very polite of you to do that. It'll remind me that I need to speak a little bit slower to make sure that everyone understands this information. I appreciate everyone joining us, so let's get started with rendering some SketchUp models. If you have a trial version of IRender Next installed, it is possible that the toolbar doesn't load automatically. So if that's your experience, just click on Extensions. And when you do, you'll see the IRender Next load option. Click on it. That'll load the toolbar. Now, also, the toolbar, of course, by default, will load adjacent to the SketchUp toolbar. If you're like me, I peel it away. That way I can place it anywhere on the screen that I want and access the IRender Next functions. I also want to mention that at Render Plus Software, we publish several free extensions to SketchUp. And one of them can be accessed by clicking on this little paintbrush icon. This is the NXT library. It's a materials library that has over 500 materials for your SketchUp models. And not only did we add these materials, additionally, we added materials with various options for reflections and highlighting. What that means is that not only can you select a material, but you have the opportunity to select a material with presets established for reflections and highlighting. Of course, like every other material, you can vary the values that we have preset to fine-tune the material for your SketchUp model. But by adding these presets, we thought it makes it a whole lot easier to select a material, select the appropriate preset for reflections and highlighting, and then click Render. So here's this little table, and I want to use this table to demonstrate a very interesting option available with IRender Next. When we click the Render button, by default, this dialog appears. This is the presets dialog, and you'll notice across the top there are 5 lighting presets. Now these presets are addressing natural lighting only. They don't affect any artificial lights that you've added to your model, just natural lighting. The 3 buttons in the middle are very easy to understand. They are manipulating the SketchUp sun. It's either on or it is off. But the 2 on the outside are maybe not so obvious. So first, let's take a look at Studio High Dynamic Lighting. The concept is quite simple. If we took this table to a professional photographer, the photographer would set up lighting in their studio with all of the appropriate filters and backgrounds and return to us a professional photograph of our table. Studio High Dynamic Lighting uses exactly this same idea. And so, when we render the table using Studio High Dynamic Lighting, you'll notice immediately that there are multiple soft shadows underneath this table. That lets you know that Studio High Dynamic Lighting is a multiple light source rendering option, gives us very nice highlighting on the model, and is the same as if a professional photographer would have shot a photo for you of this table. Now, for those of you who don't have much experience with IRender Next, I want to point out that once a rendering is completed, you are viewing the IRender Next render window. And so you'll notice that we don't really see the SketchUp interface at this point. SketchUp is laying underneath this window. And even with this window open and a rendering displaying, we can actually interact with the model. For example, if I click on the top of this table, that brings up a dialog, and an option on this dialog is Edit Material. When I click it, I get the Edit Material dialog. And what that's going to allow me to do is make some changes to the wood material. Now, if you have a very recent version of IRender Next installed, the last tab on this dialog is now labeled Presets, not Default. An older version of IRender Next will be labeled Default, but that's the only difference, is the label on the tab. So click Default or Presets, and you'll have access to 9 preset options for rendering this material. These preset options are named in a very logical way. It's actually quite easy to anticipate the rendering option once you click, for example, reflective. Now you'll notice that we once we click reflective, we're returned to the main tab. And this shows us some values that are very important. In the middle, reflection and highlight. To increase the intensity of the reflection, to make the material more reflective, increase the intensity. To increase the sharpness of the reflection, bump up the sharpness value. Now, sharpness means the smoothness of the surface. The smoother the surface, the more mirror-like the reflection. The rougher the surface, the more diffused the reflection. I'm going to pause and ask if there are any questions on intensity value and sharpness. In a rendering program, we have to address two values, and the first is the intensity of the reflection, and that is how reflective is the surface. Increasing the intensity to a value of 1 makes the material mirror-like. Lowering intensity to a value of 0 means the material will reflect light, but will not reflect its surroundings. Increasing the sharpness value to 1 makes the surface as smooth as possible. So for example, if intensity is set to 1 and sharpness is set to 1, you will render a mirror-like surface. Remember, this is Studio High Dynamic. The intensity is set to 0.6. And so what we're getting is a sampling of this wood texture in direct light, that's over here on the left, in diffused light, more towards the middle, and also then in shadow. This lighting preset can be also very appropriate for architectural models and also interiors. However, is most appropriate when you want a quick lighting option to render objects. The benefit to this rendering is that I'm able to see how this material will sample in bright direct light, in filtered light, and in shadow. So I have a pretty good idea of the quality of rendering that I will get when I include this table in any larger model. I want to point out this blue button with an arrow in it because I think sometimes it's not so obvious that with the render window open, if you click this blue dot, this brings up a little resume rendering dialog. Now here's why this is important. We encourage you, when you are generating a first rendering of a model, to create your model with a relatively low image resolution set, and also limit the number of rendering passes. The reason to do this is for the sake of efficiency. That will process a rendering very quickly. Low resolution, limited number of passes. Once that rendering is complete, you might decide that you are perfectly satisfied with what's happening in your rendering. If that's true, it's not necessary to return to SketchUp or start a new rendering from scratch. Instead, you can double up the passes. You can also, by the way, just type in the number of passes. And once you do, click OK. The rendering engine will pick up where it left off. I captured a screen here at pass 16. We're going to render 20 total. And you'll see that the quality of the rendering is improving with each successive pass. Once this rendering is complete, the blue button will enable once again. And so if you'd like to continue with more passes, click the blue button, specify the number of passes, click OK, and let the rendering engine continue to refine your rendering. So here's my completed rendering of a table. This actually was a rendering that was completed with just 20 passes using Studio High Dynamic Lighting as the lighting option. Let me pause. Anyone have any questions about Studio High Dynamic Lighting or anything else that we've discussed so far? I'm going to give you a chance to type in a question if you have one, and in the meantime, I'll continue with the beach cottage. So again, anytime I open a model, and I have to tell you, especially when it's a model that I've captured from the 3D warehouse, the first thing that I like to do is generate a rendering. This gives us a look at a second lighting preset, exterior with sun. This just means that the primary light source for this model will be the SketchUp sun. Here's the completed rendering. You'll notice that we have our own rendering of the SketchUp sky. It's a nice, bright, clear sky. It's being reflected in the windows, which is quite nice, and very nice shadows generated by the SketchUp sun. Just like before, we're looking at the IRender Next Render window, and I want to point out that if you ever have a rendering that's completed and you feel as though there are a few things that you'd like to adjust, instead of saving the rendering and taking it out to an imaging software, it's also possible to make quite a few changes right here in the render window. So for example, when I click this button, I have options for tone adjustments on my completed image, and I have some filters that I can apply. As an example, what I'd like to do is brighten this image. So we're going to adjust it to 10% brighter. One of the things that did for me was it brightened up the SketchUp sky, so this looks more like a bright midday image, and it also improved the reflections of this clear sky in the glass. However, what I lost was a little bit of contrast on that siding. The remedy is the sharpen filter. So again, these are things that you might ordinarily capture the image as a PNG or JPEG file, open it up in an imaging software and make these adjustments. There still might be a couple of times when there are some adjustments that you want to make where another program is required. But I think for the most part, you might find that our features are sufficient for most of the adjustments that you want to make. When I click Sharpen, that returns the contrast to the image, and so I get all the detail back in the siding. And the nice thing is that I'm able to make these changes to a completed rendering, so I didn't have to adjust any of the render options. Instead, post-process the rendering, and now it's appropriate to save. So I have a really nice sun-shaded image of my model. Presentation image number 1. The clipboard is the full set of rendering options. They're listed on the left-hand side, collections of rendering options. At the top of the list is presets. Most of this will look pretty familiar. And what I want to do is I want to change away from the SketchUp sky and use an option called High Dynamic Range Images. IRender Next includes a library of HDR images that can be used to both illuminate the model and can also be used as a background for your rendering. So for example, here is an HDRI image. This is now being used to illuminate the model, and it is a background for the image. You'll notice that in the windows, there are now some clouds being reflected. The HDR image is also, because light is being generated from this image, you'll notice that there are some very nice subtle shadows on our model. The renderer finds the brightest point in the image and will use that as the sun position. It's also capturing other points in this image and generating from those bright points light sources. So this is a multiple light source rendering. In IRender Next, light is also bouncing off of surfaces. The proof is that the underside of this porch is not black. Now, it is not very brightly illuminated, but in actual fact, there's light being bounced off of the ground and off of all of the other surfaces that's contributing to the brightness of all of the surfaces in this model. The FX icon is some special effects that you can add to a rendering. One of them that actually can be quite interesting is the introduction of haze. To illustrate haze, what I decided was that this building way over here on the right is not really a part of my project, and so I want to use haze to suppress the view of that building and keep my customer a little bit focused on my building. Now, you'll notice this looks kind of complicated because there's a near and far distance for the haze. I have absolutely no idea in this image how far away that building is. And so I'm going to click this little less than sign. And when I do, that allows me to come over here and just click on the rendered image. And when I do, the distance is set. Now all I need to do is specify the strength of the haze. And again, without re-rendering anything, I am post-processing a completed rendered image. And by adding haze, I've pushed that other building back and away from my model. This is rendering number 2 that I can now save as a potential image to include in either my client presentation or my proposal for this project. Anytime that you have an image that you would like to keep, click on the floppy disk icon and you'll notice quite a few file options. So here is rendering number 2 of my beach cottage. Now, once I had this model opened and I'd rendered it a few times, I did make a few changes. You'll notice that I made the doors red. I think that's a little more interesting. And I did add some light fixtures. We're going to talk about adding light fixtures in more detail in just a few minutes. But what I wanted to introduce you to is a light balancing feature in IRender Next that is accessed by clicking on this little light bulb icon. That brings up this dialog. With this dialog, what I'm able to do is manipulate lighting in the finished rendering and so balance the lighting for my project. The check mark is the on-off switch for the specific light channel, in this case the sun. And so you'll notice over here on the left side of the model there is a shadow being cast by the sun. And when I uncheck sun, that shadow goes away. So now I'm not using the sun, I'm just using the light from the HDR image. On the sky, you'll notice that in this little area, is a numeric value. That is actually the brightness of that light channel. So with the check mark, you can flip the light channel on or off. By adjusting the values, you can brighten or darken that light channel. We're going to darken it, so down to 0.2. This is giving me now more of a dawn or dusk style rendering. And of course, the darker the sky gets, it's appropriate to turn on a few lights. I've placed 3 garden lights, a light under the porch, and then I've also placed some recessed cans underneath this overhang. When we flip the switches for these, all of them turn on. Again, we are post-processing an image. So from a bright daylight image, using this light balancing dialog called light channels, I'm able to generate a second image from a completed rendering. Rendering number 3. Same model, same perspective, a different HDR image. This is the sunset HDR image. I wanted to show this one to you. Okay. I have a question by Steve. Were you able to darken the sky because you had other lighting channels? Steve, that is such an excellent question. I'm going to back up. Oops. Okay. For this image, I actually shortened this dialog to make it fit. On the bottom of this dialog, one of the things that you'll notice, and I'm going to just see if I can pop one up here real quick. You'll notice on the bottom of this dialog, there is an area called overall luminance. And this lock luminance may or may not be checked. When it is checked, that will allow you, by altering the value in each specific light channel, to brighten or darken the overall appearance of the image. If this box is unchecked, you can manipulate light channels. However, the overall luminance of the image is fixed. And so that can get a little bit confusing. For example, what might happen is let's just do it with this one. Let's turn off the sun. And so all of the sun goes away. And you'll notice that that had the effect of also dimming the image. Let me turn the sun back on. And now let me uncheck this box and now turn off the sun. And what you notice is that as I turn off different light channels, the overall brightness of the image is actually maintained. It gives you strange effects, but it's the overall brightness of the image is absolutely fixed. Let me turn these back on. And now I'm going to lock the luminance. And so when I turn off the sun and when I turn off the sky, Now the overall brightness of the image is going to dim considerably, and only the artificial lighting is being used. Okay, and Steve says, as a follow-up question, when I go lower than 1, I go black. The most likely cause, of course, if all the light channels are turned off, I'm going to have a black image. So, and the only difference is the only reason that this is still illuminated is because that's actually a background, not an HDRI sky. However, if I turn on my sorry, I have to remember, oh, it's this guy right here, channel number 5. Channel number 5 is just some recessed lighting up in here. And you'll notice that as I go lower than 1, these lights are just going to dim really nicely for me. So now I'm at 0.3, very, very dim lighting. Now I'm going to go even lower than that. And Steve, this is only possible because I have lock luminance checked. Otherwise, the software would be retaining the brightness of the image no matter how low or bright I set these light values. Now, Steve, is that helpful to you? When unchecked, the luminance of the image overall is set. And so you can turn on or off lights, and then everything else is going to adjust to retain the original brightness of the image. When checked, the original luminance of the image will not be set, so you can manipulate light channels and affect the brightness of the image. Let's reset everyone and get back to my image. By the way, this is kind of interesting. This is actually a rendering that, as I was manipulating light channels, you might be interested to know that this is a rendering in process. So right now I'm at pass 91 on this rendering. Okay. And Steve says the lock luminance makes sense. Now, I want to help everybody out here. Steve has been using IRender Next for a while and has created well over 40 renderings. And so I appreciate that this makes sense to Steve. And I also appreciate that it is kind of a complicated notion. And so, to put it simply, just remember this. When you are balancing lighting and you're manipulating lights by either turning them on or off, or brightening or darkening individual light channels, if you want the overall brightness of the image to stay the same no matter what you do to light channels, uncheck that box. If you want the overall brightness of the image to change when I turn down lights, I expect that the room will get darker. When I brighten lights, I expect that the room will get brighter. In other words, you want the image to behave more like the actual room. Check that box. Lock luminance. Check it. And that'll be your experience. I wanted to show you this comparison because on the left is an HDR image used as the sky and as the rendering background. That is a midday blue sky, some clouds background. And you'll notice that the rendering, the materials in the rendering are artistically cool. They're more blue than the rendering on the right, which is a sunset image, the primary light source being a setting sun, and so the materials in this model are considerably warmer. That's a very important idea for you to understand, in that lighting is not only illuminating a surface, it's also influencing the color of the surface in the rendering based on the color of the light. And we're going to cover that in more detail as well. Here's an actual pair of renderings from an IRender Next user showing exactly the same idea, a nice neutral blue sky, and look at the influence of the lighting on the model, and then of course more of a sunset image which warms up the rendering considerably. Another really nice example of what we were just looking at, this again is a rendering by an IRender Next user, and one rendering was completed and then two renderings were stored by manipulating lighting channels. In this case, turning off these interior lights and then turning them on. That's a post-rendering feature of IRender Next, the ability to balance lights using the lighting channels dialog. So here's my rendering with the sunset sky, again, much warmer than the bright daylight, even when I dimmed down that image to make it look more like evening. And additionally, what I did was, for the porch light and these recessed lights underneath this overhang, I modified the color of those lights so that they would render more as incandescent bulbs, a warmer glow than the default white light. I think most of you will agree that when you purchase lighting, it's actually quite difficult to get perfectly white light. So here are the two renderings side by side, again very neutral, and to the right much warmer. And for my style of rendering, my preference is the rendering to the right. Nice thing about IRender Next is that you're able to manage the process of the rendering and the quality of the rendering to match your rendering style. So let's talk a little bit about artificial lighting and what it takes to add artificial lights to a model. I wanted to kind of interject this rendering because this is a rendering that's using natural lighting only, and the person who generated this rendering was very attentive to detail. The light entering this space is of course very bright, so it's a very bright sunny day. And what I liked in particular, this is such a subtle thing, but notice the haze in front of this tree back here. So it makes this rendering not only very bright, but also gives us the impression that it is quite warm wherever this building happens to be because of the haze. Unlike the last rendering where bright sunlight was invading the space, this rendering has a lot of natural lighting, but you'll notice not bright sunlight entering the space. So more of a light to the other side of the building approach to a rendering, and quite realistic. So we're still getting really nice highlighting on the floor, and of course helps us appreciate the artificial lighting that's being used to illuminate this interior space. One of my favorite renderings. So here is this simple little interior that I put together, and this is going to help us, first of all, explore adding some artificial lights to this model. When we click on this little chandelier icon on the IRender Next toolbar, that brings up the Render Ready Components dialog. This is a library, a very nice collection of artificial lights that are, when selected, you can pop them right into your model, and they will add artificial lights when you render. There's not a whole lot to be concerned with. The size of the fixture itself, how bright is the light expressed in watts, what color is the light, and we discussed a minute ago that that's a very nice detail to pay attention to, and then the lighting channel that you might want to place this light fixture on. There are 8 available channels. When left at 0, that means that IRender Next will assign the channel automatically. So for example, it will gather similar light fixtures like ceiling lights and place all of the ceiling lights on their own channel. If that's not what you intend, you can always specify your own channel, numbers 1 through 8. So we're going to place a couple of these lights. They are set to glue to the surface, and so point and click. Now these overhead light fixtures are added. Now I have 2 sconces that I'd like to place over those pictures. So again, this is the Render Ready Components dialog. Select a light fixture, specify the brightness of the bulbs, the color of the light. If you'd like to be deliberate about a channel, set that. Otherwise, place the fixtures. And then lastly, I selected a very nice little desk lamp. And like all of the others, this is ready to click and place. This is, of course, a fully editable SketchUp model. And so when I placed this one, I actually changed the color to a brass color. I didn't want a black lamp. I wanted a brass lamp. And so I made one simple edit to the material of this little model. And now, when we render the model, here is our model rendered with this lighting solution. The lighting is quite nice, but what this model lacks is detail. And the detail that I'm referring to specifically is highlighting and reflections on the materials being used in this model. And so next, let's take a look at adding and managing reflections to a SketchUp model. If I were to tell you that all materials reflect, that might be surprising. But first and foremost, we know that these materials are reflective because they are reflecting light. So now what we want to do is we want to focus on the material's specific ability to reflect the surroundings and also to demonstrate highlighting based on light that's striking. So I thought what I'd do is show you a couple of renderings. Again, these are created by IRender Next end users, where there's been quite a bit of attention paid to highlighting and reflections. When my rendering is finished, here's what I'm after. And what I thought I would do is let's just tour this little rendering quickly. And I can show you some of the details that I was interested in. There are some things that are pretty obvious. For example, the tabletop is a glass one, and so very reflective. The vase on the table is glass and reflective. The lamp is brass. Notice that you can tell even from here, from across the room, that it's a very reflective material. Notice I actually placed some glass in front of these pictures to make that look a little bit more realistic. And one of the more interesting things that I did was when I placed this Eames chair and rendered it the first time, I noticed that because of the lack of reflection on the black, it made the chair look as though it were upholstered with fabric. I have to say I'm not aware whether or not you can get these with fabric, but as I recall, they're generally constructed with leather. And so I wanted to make this surface look more like leather. So let's chat about how we do all of those things. Oh, and one last thing. The chair is, I believe this is a Frank Lloyd Wright design, and the chair is made of some really nice wood and has a very nicely finished wood, and so I wanted to make it highlight as well in the completed rendering. Lastly, the floor. The floor is a polished surface that I decided I didn't want to appear as mirror-like. I didn't want it to look like a high gloss waxed finish. Instead, I wanted a softer, more satin finish on this floor. And so I set the reflective and highlighting properties appropriately to give me this really nice finish on this floor. So as a brief survey of how to manage reflections, I thought we would use this lamp as our example. By default, when installed from the 3D warehouse and rendered immediately, this is the appearance, which is reflecting light, but otherwise not especially reflective. By definition, that's a matte finish. So intensity, we described this a little bit before, intensity is set to 0. So not especially reflective except for light. You'll notice that when intensity is set to 0, sharpness is disabled. This is what the lamp looks like rendered as plastic. And so the plastic look is, in this case, a reasonably rough surface, showing us mostly highlighting from the artificial lights in the room. Here's the values. Intensity very, very low. Remember, 0 would be a matte finish, so at 0.25, not much reflection going on. And sharpness also very low, so this is giving us fuzzy reflections. Here's kind of the opposite end. By selecting metal, now I have a lamp that is otherwise exactly the same. It's just that brass color. And now, by selecting metal, it actually looks like brass. Here are the values. So again, a very high intensity of reflection and a sharpness turned all the way up to give me a very smooth surface. So a very polished brass lamp. Notice that metallic is checked. Metallic is a rendering override that renders reflections in the color of the surface, in this case brass. To illustrate that a little bit more clearly, look what happens when I check glossy. Glossy is a rendering option override that limits the reflection to highlights only. So we're seeing the highlights from the artificial lighting in the room. Because metallic is checked, those highlights are being reflected in the color of the material, in this case that brass color. When I uncheck metallic, the highlights are now being reflected in the color of the light. Sorry, a little boring because all the lights are white. So again, the highlights being reflected in the color of the material, that's the metallic override. Because the glossy override is also checked, we're seeing highlighting only. Uncheck metallic and we get highlighting, because glossy is checked, in the color of the lighting. And now here we are back to the nice brass finish. I want to sort of point out one other interesting feature. Presets are wonderful because when I use a rendering preset, most of the time I don't need to make any other adjustments at all. But of course you always can. And so what I decided about this lamp was that because I'm going to be viewing this lamp from across the room, when it's being rendered as a very smooth surface, there's a lot of fine detail in the reflection. And I kind of wanted to make the reflections more apparent from across the room. So the way that I decided to do that was to lower the sharpness. So here's the sharpness of 1, and then here's a sharpness that's considerably lower, I think about 0.4. That'll make the reflections much more apparent from way across the room because those highlight spots are going to be so much brighter from across the room. Here's the two side by side just by comparison. I also wanted to point out in this part of the room another feature of IRender Next that sometimes can be overlooked but can be very important when you're trying to process a photorealistic rendering. And this is specifically applying texture. So one texture that is very useful for a material that's applied using a photograph, in this case the brick wall, is auto bump. Now, auto bump is a very easy thing to understand. What it's going to do is it's going to increase the contrast of this brick wall and give it more 3D relief. Auto bump is only available for materials that are photographic. So materials that are a color, when I click the Edit Material dialog, Auto Bump will not display on the menu. Photo materials only. The use of the Auto Bump texture is going to be much more obvious in a rendering a little bit further down the road. Now this chair, direct from the 3D warehouse, and since reflection is not available in SketchUp rendering, no reflective values were assigned at all. So once you are reasonably familiar with setting intensity and sharpness, you might not require a preset. In this case, I wanted very intense reflections, and that means very, very bright, but I also wanted them very fuzzy. And so I lowered sharpness considerably, and when I render the chair, now I get very nice highlighting. Exaggerated slightly because, again, I'm looking at this chair from across the room. Don't overlook the obvious, friends. On these pictures, the best way to make it look like there is glass in front of these pictures is to add a surface, use the preset glass, and you're done. Glass can be rendered in one of two ways. We have a thick glass option. Nice thing about thick glass is that thick glass refracts light. And so when I render this table, the light is being refracted as it passes through the glass. And if you watch the edge of this area rug, here's the table before. Watch the edge of the rug shift when the light gets refracted. Much more realistic. I also applied a caustic value. Caustic means that some light is lost as it passes through the glass. And that's why even the glass will cast a little bit of a shadow underneath the table. Use any of these options to match your idea of what these materials should look like in the rendering. Here we go with the wood floor. Now keep in mind, what I'm after is a satin-like finish, and that means lower the sharpness value so that I get diffused or fuzzy reflections on this floor. Next, the vase. Now again, I'm going to show you an interesting way to approach reflections, by setting my own values entirely. So I'm setting metallic on, and that means that all of the reflections are going to be in the color of the vase, which is an ivory color. I've got the intensity of the reflections very high, so I'm going to get a lot of reflection off of this vase. The sharpness set to the extreme, which is 1, and that means I'm going to get a very smooth, sharp reflection off of this vase. And then lastly, what I did was I set transparency to 10%. So I'm going to be able to kind of see through this vase. And this gives me this really interesting glass vase. The point to all of that is just that when you are, as you become more aware of the reflection and highlighting and transparency, all of these values that you can set for specific materials, you can adjust them to match your idea of the material for the rendering. Last, I just real quickly wanted to make the column appear to be not painted with a flat paint, but more of a glossy paint. And so I set some values for the column as well. This image is just to show you that on the left, this is the Eames chair untouched. I think you'll agree with me that I really could mistake that for fabric in this finished rendering. Well, I wanted to make sure that it was clear that it was leather. And so I set intensity and sharpness for the upholstery on the chair, and now I have what I believe looks a lot like a leather material. It's these attentions to detail for all of the components that you place in your SketchUp model that will enhance the photorealism of the final rendering. And so if you take the time to place a component in your model, it's a good idea to take a little bit more time to address the materials that make up that component so that they'll render properly. Prior to adding any reflections, this is just the lighting solution. And now the completed rendering with the reflections added. My favorite thing is the floor, because the floor, it's an important part of this rendering because it does occupy so much of the rendered space. I also really like the brick wall. Notice how it looks like there's a lot of relief between the brick and the texture of the brick and of course the mortar, and that's because of one simple texture applied, the auto bump texture. Makes it look like a real brick wall. The glass applied over the pictures, getting some nice reflections from the lighting. The table, of course, the vase. All of these details help enhance the realistic appearance of the final rendering. You'll remember earlier that I mentioned that the quality of the rendering is enhanced with each successive pass. Most notably, that's true with regard to reflections that have a low sharpness value. If you want to achieve really good fuzzy reflections, the best way is to increase the number of passes. Here's my rendering after 5 passes, doing a pretty nice job even early on in solving the lighting for me. But you'll notice that there's nothing especially fuzzy about the reflections on the floor. Here's the same. Here we are after 10 passes. Things are improving pretty nicely. The lighting is, of course, made it a long way. It's much better solved. Here we are at 20 passes. For so many renderings, 20 passes is usually quite sufficient. But in terms of what I was after on this floor, I wasn't quite satisfied, so I went 50 passes. Now I'm actually approaching a rendering that I would be very happy to show my client. Here we are at 100 passes. Again, now the lighting is very nice. The reflections are very fuzzy, but I wanted to just go further, and so I actually let this go for 1,000 passes. At 1,000 passes, I obviously let the rendering process for several hours, but the result is, for my purposes, worth it. And I want to mention that I actually had time, and so was perfectly content to let this rendering continue to process. The most important part of this rendering, and the best improvement after 1,000 passes, is the reflections on the floor, which now absolutely are giving me this really nice satin-looking finish on this floor. Does anyone have any questions about lighting, reflections, or any of the terms that we've talked about today? What I want to do is I want to introduce a couple of other options in IRender next that, again, I think, sometimes these are kind of underutilized. And so if you haven't tried these features, especially if you have a trial version and a nice model that you're anxious to render, I think you'd be quite surprised at how easy some of these features are to use. What you're seeing on the screen now is a panoramic image. This is 360-degree panoramic image created with IRender Next. These do require a bit of a time commitment. This rendering is 4,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels, so it is a high resolution image. And because it's so high resolution, it does take quite a bit of time to render. Now, this was completed in just 20 passes, but still took several hours to render because it's high resolution and there are a lot of artificial lights in this model. So there are lights down this hallway, there are lights under here, there are artificial suspended lights, there are lights on the porch, and of course there's the sun and the sky. So lots of lighting, also increasing the time needed to process this rendering. But the benefit that I get for that time commitment is this. And this does not show real well webcasting because there's probably too much lag. So what I did was I used a free 360 viewer. And by the way, this is a standalone application that you can install on your computer. There's also, of course, lots of ways to display these images on a web page. They're all free as well. I captured just a few images, but imagine going to a client presentation, having a really nice panoramic image ready to go, pushing the mouse over to your client, and let your client just navigate the image. I think people are still fascinated by these images. They're actually very impressive. And when you have a really nice photorealistic rendering that can be viewed as a panorama, I think your client would really enjoy that. So I actually, across the bottom, captured a few stills from that panoramic image. So I'm just panning around from left towards the right and capturing images along the way. Absolutely worth it, a really nice rendering option with IRender Next. Okay, so you see, while we were going through our information, we went from 90 passes up to 116. And I also thought it'd be interesting, just for fun, let me show you, before we call it a day here, for those of you who can stick around for a few more minutes, this rendering is using the packet tracer. Let me go back to IRender Next, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. And you know what, Steve? I don't know if you've used the other rendering options, so this might be most interesting to you. There are, in the rendering engine, 3 options. There's the packet mode. That's the default. That's considered the fastest. Does a really nice job of rendering. There's also a path tracer. That is a different process for ray tracing. It requires more passes in order to give you a quality rendering, but the results are quite interesting. And then there's the last one is the test engine. The two that I want to show you, I'm going to go grab a couple of images here. There we go. Okay. Bear with me just a minute. Let me grab these images. Okay. This is an earlier iteration of this model. This is using the path tracer, and it is using the path tracer. I had 536 passes. This is using packet mode. That's the fast one. And the packet mode was used for 673 passes. And you'll notice that there are some interesting differences in the renderings themselves. You know, this is a little model that I made. I was experimenting with creating stained glass. And for those of you who find that challenging, I'm going to probably create a rendering tip in the next week or so on creating things like stained glass and managing colored glass in a model. So the quality of both renderings is actually quite good, and the lighting solution is beautiful. You'll notice that one of the differences is the ceiling is influenced considerably more by the color of the floor as light bounces off the floor than in the path tracer. The path tracer still, I think, would benefit from quite a few more passes in order to probably match the clarity of the packet mode image. The point to all of this is simply that there are some options for processing renderings, and if you're new to IRender Next, choose a low resolution for the finished rendering, and then have some fun experimenting with these options for processing the completed rendering. You'll find that one will probably emerge as your preference for the quality of the image that you're after. And so I want to ask Steve, I'm hoping Steve is still here. Steve, have you any experience with the path tracer rendering option? Or do you just use packet mode? Okay, so Steve says he hasn't. You know what, Steve? And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring that up, Steve, was because what I'm seeing is that there are so many options in IRender Next. You know, we take the obvious things and we put them right in front of you so that the things that you must click in order to make a good rendering, they're available. But there are lots of advanced options that sometimes it can be pretty easy to overlook. So when you have a chance, give that other rendering option a try, and then shoot me an email and let me know what your experience is. I'm actually quite impressed by the quality of renderings that both of those engines produce. I have a hard time deciding which one I like better because they both have some things happening that just make them absolutely spectacular. If you have questions about IRender Next, specific features, or any of the information that we've talked about today, please send a question to support@renderplus.com. We're monitoring questions constantly, and we have lots of people answering those emails. So please don't be shy. Additionally, don't forget RenderPlus Systems on YouTube for lots of helpful videos on using IRender Next, and of course, renderplus.com, a great resource for adding to your skills with our rendering programs. I hope this has been helpful. I will send everyone an email once I have the recording of this video posted to YouTube. And until next time, let's go get some renderings completed. Thanks, everybody.